Today, we're talking about Canadians' reactions to Bill C-2, the government's attempt to strengthen our borders. Welcome to Spin Nation. We want to slice through the noise to reveal the forces shaping Canadian perspectives. Hello, Emmanuel Husband. How are you today?
Hello, Laurel, my wife.
I asked you how you are today, but I know how you are today because I've seen you all day already. I don't know why I asked you that.
That's what you get working from home. That's a husband and wife team.
I know how you feel every day, all day long, probably vice versa.
So today we're going to talk about Canadians' reaction to Bill C-2. And it's really important to look at the data from a multiple number of sources before opinions crystallize.
Yeah, this bill has caused quite the firestorm, and we're seeing right away different, let's say, forces out there trying to plant their messages in Canadians' minds on whether or not Bill C-2 is good or bad or ugly.
So there's been a lot of reaction in the news, on social media. We're going to take a look at all of those and build out some insights on why the differences can provide a good idea of how different groups of Canadians are reacting.
And I'm sure there's going to be lots of polling happening around this as well. But this moment is critical because it's before people have crystallized those opinions that is going to show up in the polls. Right now, we're going to really see the campaigns and actions. What are Canadians saying about C2? That's going to be our business question for today. Manuel, do you want to get us started with a view of the data?
Yeah. So what we did is we pulled comments, posts, and all of that across a multitude of different media and social outlets. And what happens is different audiences tend to gravitate to different media. As we talked about extensively in some of our previous shows around the echo chambers. But comparing and contrasting between these channels really helps policymakers or just somebody who's trying to navigate this understand a little bit and a little bit faster than the others how these opinions are being formed, and hopefully have a chance to affect them before they've become final. So the data that I'm showing you right now looks at within the topic of C2, what are the key concerns or areas of discussion? And so we broke it down into four categories: the refugees and asylum seekers, civil liberties, general immigration, and finally, money laundering, the thing about having the ability to, or the inability, the future inability of being able to pay using cash money for larger amounts.
I mean, those of us who come from a finance background like I do, money laundering, AML, I can't even tell you how many of those compliance modules I have done over my 20-something year career. So it's sort of interesting to see this come up and people paying attention to anti-money laundering legislation. That doesn't happen too often. Usually that's the realm of very much the policy wonks of the world.
So what's really interesting in our results is that we find that there's a big contrast between the coverage from news organizations um, and social media, in particular Twitter. So what we see in the news is a high focus. Almost 51% of media stories talk about immigration. 33% talk about refugee claims and asylum seekers. And money laundering comes in fourth, actually, with barely 14% of the issues. But that's in stark contrast with the conversation on Twitter. There we see civil liberties with 39% of the share of conversation, and money laundering with almost double the interest of news media at 28%. So there's a big divide in the Canadian conversation between media and social media.
But that personally feels like it tracks because if you are on X a fair amount, I'm probably on it more than I want to admit. But there are a lot of, let's say, crypto warriors. There's a lot of freedom warriors. So the fact that civil liberties is the top topic, money laundering number two, it seems like that's what would resonate with the category of people who are being drawn to the Twitter sphere right now.
That makes sense. But I would say this makes it difficult for a policymaker or the government to really thread the needle between these two groups. If you're only getting your assessment of what and how people think just by reading the news, you're missing an important piece of the conversation and one that is very heated. When we look at some of the top disseminators of news in that space, we've got some relatively controversial media like Rebel News that are out there pushing against or pushing back against some of this legislation, um, as well as the more traditional news outlet, but far, far, far down the line.
It seems like Carney has done what is difficult to do, and that's get every single stakeholder group mad at this one piece of legislation. He doesn't seem to have any allies in it, as far as we're seeing so far.
Yeah, definitely, both from the left, who's pushing back on some of the immigration and refugee provisions, and from the right when it comes to civil liberties and money laundering in particular.
I just want to, before we kind of move on to the other channels, to me it is stark how refugees are about over 30% of the coverage in the news. So, for those who are listening to our podcast, the reason we look at this kind of data is it helps us understand like which issues or topics is resonating with readers or resonating with those who are writing the content, whether that's the article or writing the tweets or doing the YouTubes. Is if they're talking, like the news is talking a lot about refugees, but that's barely showing up on Reddit, YouTube, or Twitter. So that sort of indicates that for journalists and editors, they think the refugee issue is really front and center, but that doesn't seem to be as holding true for the user generated content that we see on social media channels. So the fact that they're tightening the rules for refugees, either they don't care or it's sort of meeting expectations and not worth talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It just might not be top of mind or have a direct impact on these folks' life.
Or it could be proof that the organizations out there who are championing refugee rights are being very effective at getting their message across with traditional media.
But if that's the case, may be ineffective at getting their message across in the more populist channels.
That's definitely quite the possibility that they've gotten news editors to kind of latch on to this being a key issue and part of this legislation, but either they haven't tried yet to make it relevant to the broader population or it's just not resonating. But not the case with civil liberties. That's absolutely front and center. And Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube about equal. About 17% of users are talking about civil liberties.
Yeah, and Reddit a little more on immigration than YouTube, but it's a more muted conversation on both of those channels.
Okay, well, there's another cut of the data that you did, which is kind of interesting. And we looked at it, Manuel, you're Quebecois, so we can trust your French on this and your your French analysis. But you sort of looked at the Franco versus Anglo conversation. Do you want to move to that now?
Yeah, so this is interesting for me because while I'm familiar and can totally understand some of the concerns around the money laundering provisions, it hasn't occurred to me naturally that this was a big issue. And what I'm realizing at looking at this data is it might be because of a cultural blind spot, maybe is the right word around this whole thing. So if we compare the topics across English and French news, you could see refugees, civil liberties, immigration, all of those are pretty much equal. But there's a big difference on the money laundering, with 18% of stories in English mentioning some of these provisions, but only 7% in French. So that makes me think, and as a Quebecer, um, perhaps there's something to that. It's just not necessarily a preoccupation that we have as much in Quebec.
I mean, I kind of wonder why, because the same rules apply across. And, Quebec has, I mean, it's a very tech forward. Do they have a big crypto community in Quebec? I'm actually in Montreal is very tech forward. So I would thought they might be more engaged in that side of the community with Web3, crypto, and those who sort of are more attuned to, let's say, around having freedom with their money and wanting the freedom to move their money around, which is sort of why a lot of people buy in or are interested in crypto. But yeah, I guess for whatever reason, that Quebecois consciousness is not really too concerned with with regulations like this.
Well, I got to say, for me personally, it would never have occurred to me to pay, a $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 invoice cash. I also know on a regular basis over the decades, there's been a number of scandals around organized crime collecting money using cash donations in shoeboxes or in socks. So maybe this is something that's been already ingrained in the population, that a lot of the time these can be ways to funnel money illegally. So maybe some more awareness of that. I'm not sure.
All right. Well, definitely a distinction between the English and French media on the reaction to money laundering. Something for the government who are communicating this bill to look at if they're trying to get support in French Canada.
So, Laurel, what's the so what about this? What should a policymaker be thinking about right now?
Well, obviously, civil issue of civil liberties. This is cross-cutting across all channels and across both languages. So I'd be prioritizing that as where we need to beef up communications, making sure are there inaccuracies that are being perpetuated across the different channels that can be corrected. I'd be getting some of my strongest voices out there, really thinking about not just the news channels, but how are you getting into all of the social channels to reinforce, what does that really mean for everyday Canadians? There's obviously a lot of sensitivity around that, so you have to tread pretty carefully there.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, the one way to engage with audiences is to engage through the media that they trust, and that can be pretty painful. Going on media tour of personalities that perhaps are not aligned at all with the views of the government. But that might be the only way to get through some of the echo chambers that we have in Canada right now.
I think that's a great point. This is really about trust. And when you're coming to things around personal liberties, I mean, you and I lived in China, and I think the number one concern that all of our friends and family here in Canada had were about our liberties, right? Our ability to move around, our ability to freely express ourselves. I will say for the record, it was not what you expect when you live there. However, there is a true sensitivity here in North America, I think more than you see in other parts of the world. Part of that is our proximity to the United States. Part of that is who we are. But this is a place that you really can't just leave it up to the ecosphere to try to educate. I think if I was working in government, I would be taking very specific strides. And I think your point around making sure you're engaging with those voices that people already trust on this issue, those are going to be hard. But, it's going to be the only way forward, especially if there is misinformation or misunderstandings about what really happens with the bill.
That's right. Difficult, but in our opinion, necessary.
And the other big sensitive topic here, which is a little bit surprising, is around the anti-money laundering legislation. It's been around a long time. There's always been controls, let's say, of amounts above $10,000. I guess they're tightening those up. There's going to be good reasons for those, and it's probably just not being communicated very well. To your point, how often are you going around with $10,000 in a shoebox and giving that to anybody for whatever reason?
Yeah, but I understand the concern. It's certainly possible that, should the government change and should attitudes change, that this would create some controls to where regular citizens are not allowed to do perfectly legal things. So I understand the concern for sure.
The one that I'm a little bit more curious to watch is on the immigration and refugee. As we've seen in previous analysis, this issue around immigration, or that we've had too much or uncontrolled immigration in Canada, is a very big hot topic, especially in more right or conservative leaning voices. The proposed bill is looking to tighten up, let's say, some of the controls there. Though I guess it seems that's where the people on the left are getting upset. So again, it's going to be a bit of a right to left, thinking about how you message this between sort of the left-leaning and more progressive groups versus right-leaning groups. Right-leaning groups might like this. Left-leaning groups are saying, no, this isn't right. But I think the way more that the government can communicate what the end state looks like. What is the goal? Where does the end game? There's going to be steps along the way. But if you stop explaining to people what it'll look like when we get through this, then they can't understand the path that they're on.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. A lot of uncertainty around this, and what does it mean for regular users, right? Most regular people have never had to worry about anti-money laundering rules, and now suddenly it starts to apply to a lot of people. A lot of uncertainty around that, I think.
And this is the minister of, which minister is in charge of this? He's the one he's had a few gaffes lately in the House, I think. So I don't know if he's going to be the right voice. You need a strong voice to drive this legislation through, definitely. It's a controversial one. All right, well, that's our dig into Bill C-2. And thank you for joining us on this journey. Of course, subscribe, recommend, rate our show. Your support means a lot to us. And if you have any comments, please leave them.
Until next time.
See you next time.